Well, welcome everybody to the From Sci-Fi to CX Reality, how to make AI promises come true and pay for it. So I'll let Mr. Luther introduce himself first.
Yeah, guys, good afternoon and thanks for the time. My name's Tom Luther. I'm based here in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm our Director of Strategic Partnerships and Advisory for Outsource Consultants. Last week actually marked 20 years that I've been in contact center. It's hard to believe. I was an operator for well over 14 years, ran my own journey mapping practice, and spent time in digital transformation. And then the last few years, I've been fortunate to work with Andrew and the team here at OC. Just excited to share with you some great insight today because again, we deal with a lot of great end brands, and we also deal with a lot of great third-party business process outsourcers. And so we do have a pretty good frame of reference on both sides of the labor and tech narrative. So just excited to share some of our experiences with you today.
Thank you, Tom. I'll introduce myself. I'm Andrew, also with Outsource Consultants. Been with the organization for about 4 years. So I've stopped counting. It's more than 2 decades. I'll leave it at that I've been in the CX industry. My background was more on the technology side. So Tom and I do a lot of these meetings together because we believe we bring different perspectives. I'm from the technology and the business side. Tom's got that operator experience. So hopefully we can share insights from multiple different areas. Also, a quick mention out, we'll come back around the half-hour mark. Mark, and talk with Mark. Not unintentional pun there. So we'll introduce Mark at that point. Housekeeping wise, we're going to keep this relatively closed. There is, if you go down to the bottom of the screen and hover, a bar down there, and there's a Q&A. We have our moderator, Jared, collecting those questions. There's time allotted at the end. We'd love to get through as many of them as we can. If we can't, there's follow-up options that we can get to. This really is intended to be not just us telling you what we think, but us helping bring different perspectives and solutions to your journey. So that question section is super important. Feel free in the Q&A rather than the anything else. That's the place to put questions, and we'll get back to those at the end. All right. The other thing I should probably mention, for those of you not familiar with Outsource Consultants, is what we do and where we're positioned in the market. So 11 years in operation as traditionally a BPO brokerage firm. We recently repositioned, largely because of the things we're going to talk about in this presentation. The market shifted. No longer can you separate out technology from labor and look at them in isolation and have a successful outcome. They both need to come together. So with our OCCX practice, we identified that the market has really good BPOs, especially if you know somebody who knows them and can get to them, like Outsource Consultants. There's also really good technologies. Where there was a gap is helping clients figure out when to use those two buckets. They still operate from a supply side perspective quite discreetly, and with some elements, we'll talk through this, but with some elements of competition sometimes. So it's hard to know when you talk to somebody with a bias for one or the other, whether you're getting really the true picture of what best serves your needs. So that's the gap in the market that we're looking to fill. Anything to add there, Tom, before we get rolling?
No, I think you nailed it.
Awesome. All right. So there's been what I can only describe as an adversarial relationship. So if I look back at my earlier career when I was selling technology, my value proposition to anybody in the contact center space was labor's old school. It's expensive. It's unreliable. Why don't you buy this technology? Then you have to deal with less of that nasty labor. And it started as early as, I think IVR is probably the first example, right? Where you can get to press a button, get to a certain call sector, cut down on call volumes, maybe have hours of operations as a pre-recorded thing. There's been so many examples through the last 20 or so years where it's always been, you'll need less of that difficult labor if you just buy my piece of technology. What's your favorite example, Tom, of good or bad of where you've seen that happen?
Yeah, I think everybody that's probably listening in here, and if they're being honest, has said, look, if I implement X contact center technology, that it's going to change our customer experience forever. I think we've seen enough classic cases of this not being totally true in our own personal lives to recognize that behind every good technology, there typically lies a really reliable human labor component in some way. I love your IVR example. I mean, again, we thought that was going to, rid ourselves through a call tree of eventually avoiding people to get to our agents to truly only upset the customer, right? We made it so difficult that when they eventually got to someone, they were upset. Um, the world of digital transformation is no doubt exciting and forever improving, but yet very complex. And it isn't as simple as turning on a feature or function and voila, your contact center problems are solved. The customer experience is beautiful. We all wish it was set it and forget it, but unfortunately, it's not quite there.
And I think it's important while we go through this reminiscing history lesson, whatever you want to call it, there's lessons here that are critical to what we do going forward in order to not repeat. I've already stopped people when they've asked for certain things and said, do you remember IVRs? Do you remember how excited your finance people were when you told them what it was going to do for the business, and then how mad your customers were after you deployed it? Let's make sure we don't do that again. We should have learned that lesson from the first time. We didn't. We repeated it with multiple other technologies. The critical piece here is let's not do it again with the stuff that we have available to us today. I think we're okay, but I just want to make sure nobody missed the purpose of spending a little time in the history lesson. The other thing I want to point out, this is an AI. We're getting there, right? There's lots of AI content coming. Because this is an AI-based presentation, I took the liberty of creating these slides using a tool called Crayon. If anybody was wondering what the little thing at the bottom of the screen was, it's Crayon with an extra I, so they've got AI in the name. You can go and tell it using prompts like with any good Gen AI product what you want. So I told it that I wanted a couple of adversaries from deep in history, and I got these two nice. What's fascinating about this is, firstly, how many prompts it takes to get something usable. And secondly, if you count really carefully, I believe of these two gentlemen having this conflict here, I assume that they're gentlemen, maybe that's a bad part, my part, but going back in history, probably were, they have 5 arms. So there's lots of little things that while AI is wonderful and fantastic, you need to have that human element. So for those of you that are interested in visuals, watch. There are more little things that Crayon didn't get quite perfect that I left in there because I thought it was a useful way to illustrate the point of AI is cool, but we're not totally to the point where there's not the necessity to blend it with humans. So moving forward, we passed that period of adversaries, and I don't know, I feel like this was 4, maybe 5 years ago, Tom, that it happened, that I started hearing people in the industry talking about the need to have a strategy for labor and tech. It wasn't a verse anymore. It was an acknowledgement of needing both, and really that the right strategy was combining the two. Is that timeline roughly the same as what you felt?
Yeah, I was a little too late, right? I used to have this wonderful head of hair when I was running contact centers, and people would bark at me about labor versus tech. And every time I would just pluck out hairs. And then all of a sudden they came around to it being a marriage. And by then I was bald. So yeah, about that time.
Awesome.
I
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it goes without saying, right? I've always supported the theory that the marriage between labor and tech is and should profoundly impact everyone's call center strategy. Simply shaping how businesses approach CX and operations. We as you shared earlier, we do a lot of these types of discussions, and it always comes back to today's contact centers shouldn't want reliable labor and poor tech, just the same as they don't want great tech and unreliable labor. We all believe, I hope, that you must have a well-oiled strategy that includes both elite staffing and effective use of tech. By channel, right? I think that's important to throw in there to ensure a superior CX. Outsourcing, the concept of outsource consultants and outsourcing, we'll talk about this later, can free up funds for a more focused digital transformation strategy. So again, the marriage between labor and tech is, in my opinion, reshaping call center strategy by driving efficiency, personalization, and scalability. So team labor and tech for sure.
Absolutely. And wouldn't it be really cool if that's where the story ended and it was all like Disney happiness? But there's a couple of factors that happened, and these happened roughly in the same general timeline. We got through at least the business's reaction to the pandemic. I don't mean to downplay the effect that had on anybody's lives, but from a business reaction perspective, where there was a period, cloud technology budgets seemed to flow like rivers. You couldn't not get approval for one if you tried, no matter how rough your business case was. We need flexibility. We need to work from home. And CCaaS technology and the related technologies had an absolute heyday. That dried up. And then, right as that was drying up, AI hit the mainstream. And I'm careful in using that term, as AI has been around for an awful long time, but it became in the public's awareness. And it came along as a solve. And a lot of the things that were said, like, this is going to mean we don't need human agents anymore. This is going to save so much money and make things so much better. I'm like, oh my goodness, history is repeating itself. Yes, this is a way cooler set of technologies that can do way more than an IVR from multiple decades ago. But there's a similarity of what was going on, budgets drying up, new technologies coming along, that took our happy marriage, our newly formed wedlock of labor and tech and happiness, and the honeymoon period kind of came to a crashing end. And we got ourselves in the current situation that we're in, where things are, potentially less than ideal. At this point, Jared, if you'd be so kind, our man behind the curtain, to launch the survey, what I would like to do is get some feedback from the audience. Just pick one of these. What's the closest description to the biggest barrier? I'm assuming you guys came to this because you're having some barriers with your AI CX projects and desires. What's the thing that's most in your way? Which one most closely relates to your situation? These 4 that we've put up here, Tom mentioned it earlier. We talked to a lot of end clients. We also talked to a lot of business process outsourcers or BPO partners that deal with many clients themselves and hear their stories. Our distillation of all of that came up with these 4 options. In terms of, it's not an easy situation that we're in. So I'll give everybody a minute to answer this question, and then we'll move on and talk about, okay, great. If that's the problem, what do we do about it? Because that's the crux of why we're here. All right. It was a relatively simple question, so hopefully that was sufficient time to think about it and provide your answer. So now we start to get into the meat of it. I'll tee this up, and then I know Tom's got some opinions, shockingly, for those that know him, that he'll share with us. The way that we see it is, for years and years and years, companies have funded projects in the same way. You get a project owner, they figure out what it is they want to do, and then they figure out what the justification is for the thing that they want to do, put a business case together, and they go off and they get approval for that business case. Usually somewhere in there is, this will do X for us. Often that X has a dollar figure attached to it, and it will return that within a certain period of time. So timelines and dollars come with traditional business funding. That's all well and good and has served us as the business community for a very long time. What doesn't work so well is when you take that and you mix it with this new technology. And in the generative AI arena that we're in, and the many CX solutions that leverage Gen AI, there's not a set business case. There's not, it does X, you plug it in and that's what it does. It has inherent flexibility. That means that your use case might not be the same as any of the other people that have deployed it. In fact, I would argue probably shouldn't be, because that's what makes you different and helps you differentiate your business. So if the use case is different and it relies on a steady diet of a clean data set, and you don't know that your data set's clean because you've never fed it to a Gen AI product in this manner before, a funding mechanism that says, what's this going to do for me precisely and by when, just inherently is a risky fit. Mr. Luther's nodding his head. I think it was an approval, so let's see what his thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that I still have at least 2 or 3 bad dreams a year with a CFO saying, Tom, when is the return on investment and by when? Right? I think all of us have heard that dreaded question from someone in the finance organization. But you hit it. It's not always that cut and dry with technology. A few thoughts come to mind around this. I think the first would be intangible benefits. Tech advancements offer intangible benefits that are difficult often for the operations and IT team to quantify, such as enhanced CX, concepts like improved employee sat, and overall greater strategic flexibility. Sometimes those are hard to pin down and call them tangible. These are all long-term values that might not show up to the organization as an immediate fiscal return. The second thought would be long-term gains. For instance, we talk about automation all the time. Automation might not show a quick ROI, but it can lead to significant cost savings and efficiency improvements over time. Again, very hard to plan out and prove. It's not a clear domino effect all the time. And lastly, around this for me, and again, we could talk about this topic for an hour, but change management, factors and costs. That's a big term. It's a buzz term. We hear it all the time in organizations. The process of adopting new technology involves change management costs and training, process adjustment, disruption to the organization, right? Everybody wants to kind of live in their own world, and this is going to screw up what we're working on. These can temporarily offset the benefits, making ROI appear less favorable. So again, not always cut and dry when we talk about ROI and by when.
So do we have the survey results? Can we share those? I'm kind of curious what everybody's experience is. Okay. All right, they're up on the screen. Lack of budget at roughly a quarter. The same experience as Tom's nightmares, right? At slightly more. Interestingly, data readiness, 3%. So that was not a huge concern there. And then I'm worried about the performance and reliability of AI at a whopping 45%. All right, so this is what we need to solve for. Some form of budget issue, or this stuff isn't going to work and it's going to cause me an employment problem when it doesn't because I put my name behind it. Obviously, I paraphrase slightly there, but thank you for voting. That's helpful. That helps us tune what we recommend and what we talk about in the remaining time. So let's get on to how to proceed. Tom sneaked this out a little earlier. We've seen organizations pick and choose between where they start on the, I wouldn't call it the journey, because we're constantly moving right in the CX space. But if they look at what am I going to do next, some people choose a labor strategy. Some people choose a technology strategy. Seemingly, it's a decision around what they think will give the best results the soonest. We, as an organization, have been making this recommendation for some considerable time now. And it relates into those problems we just talked about, which are related to budget and risk. And in order to best create a budget and reduce risk, you look at where most of this expense is in CX, and labor is still by far the biggest. So logically, you'd say, and I'm explaining this in a way that makes it not sound as genius as we thought it was when we dreamt it up, but figure out labor optimization, create yourself a budget is step one. Not because that necessarily yields the best CX improvement, although there are CX improvements if you do it right that you can get along the way, but because that gives you a budget that's untethered to those traditional funding methods, and that explosion that I had as the visual earlier doesn't happen. So thoughts, Tom? You've been through this as many times as I have on labor optimization as step one.
Yeah, I think labor optimization is step one, and I think we've coined the phrase bringing your own budget. And I know we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute, but I think it's a pretty cool BYOB. Maybe not the Saturday and Sunday BYOB that most of us like to enjoy, but the budget piece essentially allows the operator to have control. I mean, you nailed it a moment ago. There's not an operator on this call that hasn't struggled and probably continues to struggle with hiring and retention. It's just a historically vicious cycle of recruiting and dollars associated, hiring, dollars associated, training, dollars associated, firing, dollars associated, rinse and repeat. CFOs pressuring. Why is your contact center a cost center? It's in the red constantly. They've tried raises, gamification, career pathing, and we still struggle. Right. So again, obviously at Outsource Consultants, we view outsourcing as a tremendous way to true up your immediate staffing pains and do it in a more fiscally responsible way. Again, you kind of alluded to it, but a thought would be to take the tangible month-over-month savings to create a risk-free budget to use on your technology aspirations more quickly. So in essence, you aren't using budget.IT dollars or fighting on prioritization, but you've taken control and have brought your own budget that didn't exist to drive your aspirations faster.
Yeah, there is an internal conversation to say, hey, if we're able to find some labor optimization savings, can we keep them? And redeploy them into the business in order to solve some of the problems that we've got on the CX side. That goes one of two ways in our experience. It's either a yes, sure, because they believe you can't find the savings and then we can help you find those. Or it's a, wait a minute, you seem awful confident about that. How much money are you talking about? And the business could use some of that for the bottom line. We'll split it. You get to keep some of it. We'll take some of it for the business's purposes. We'll make a deal that way. So between you and your financial organization, there's a conversation to be had. I can't remember a case where that conversation was had and that it didn't work out. The beautiful thing with this is a small percentage savings on labor results in a huge budget comparatively to go buy technologies. I also wanted just to be clear on this point. Yes, we are outsourced consultants, so we can absolutely help with this. We feel we're in a unique position. It's not a case of I had my contact center outsourced in the US and then these guys are going to put it in the Philippines and give me a budget to go buy technology. While you could, that's not what we're recommending. We have a unique database of mid-size, and we stretch the term mid-size to include some slightly larger organizations, but mid-size BPOs that are really cost effective. So you could go from US based to US based and still create yourself a very comfortable technology budget. You could go from nearshore to nearshore. It doesn't have to be a major change. All the examples that Tom was giving, you could go from internal. We did this just for a healthcare organization recently, having terrible time retaining people. And they said, we're done. Can you just find somebody to do this for me? This is not core to our business, critical to patient experience, but we just want to be out of that. So whatever scenario you're in, please don't think this is a US-based offshoring play in order to create the budget. There are much more subtle ways that we're well positioned to help with that. So we now have, through that process, a string-free budget. And the reason that we believe that's critical is you have to get your hands on this technology, and you have to work out what your business case is when you figured out what is it capable of doing in your environment with the data set that you have to feed it. Great to know that virtually nobody's concerned about that, but it is a limiting factor. It's only as good as the data that it's fed. And if it's not clean, or you don't have a long enough history of it, or there are new call types emerging that you don't have the data set for, it's not going to function in quite the way that you might have hoped that it would.
Mm-hmm.
But once you've put all that together, and most critically, actually tested it within a small group of customers and see what their reaction is, then you know. So you've taken a small portion of the budget you've created, you've built yourself, for want of a better term, a sandbox, and figured out. That's at the point where you can more confidently say, here's my path forward. But through doing the sandbox exercise with a self-created budget, you're not exposing the business to any risk. You haven't yet made a commitment that we're going to use AI to deliver X, Y, and Z. At that point, you can start to be more confident, and you start to bring things in. And that overwhelming, I think it was 47% that said, I'm concerned about the performance of this. There's one way to be less concerned. Do it on a small scale in your company with your employees, your data set, and your customers. Anything to add to that, Tom?
No, this is a deep, longer conversation, but so I'll briefing my thoughts on it. But to your point, a self-funded path to de-risking an AI rollout while reinvesting in differentiating customer experience involves obviously a deep strategic approach that, in my opinion, balances investment, risk management, and value creation. There's many steps that we could recommend here, probably for another time, but by following a self-funded path, you obviously can effectively manage the risks associated with an AI deployment while still enhancing your CX capabilities. And by doing so, you're taking an approach that ensures a smoother transition, maximizes ROI, and fosters an experience that stands out in a very competitive marketplace. And again, with a very low risk situation. So again, deeper conversation, but self-funding it is always a really unique way to go.
Yeah, there's so many things that we want to dive into, but for the sake of time and the schedule, this is the teaser, right? Just want to throw up a quick graphic that shows create that budget through labor optimization, invest in the technology, de-risk it, do it on the quiet, build it out, make sure it's good. Don't be the person that gave the Chevy away for $1, or the airline example, or the plethora of other news articles of when things went wrong. You catch those before you roll it out because you've had the opportunity to do it in a de-risked environment. The last one, I want to touch on this briefly because it sounded relatively negative, right? This journey we've been on with CX, this combative nature between the technologies and the labor, and then the funding method's not working. It sounds a little downbeat. What's really interesting is we're seeing companies now that have done the labor optimization, that are in phase 2 that we've laid out here, that are planning for what is really exciting. And that is, once the savings are realized through that de-risked AI deployment, they're planning to come back and dominate in their industry by delivering high-level CX, which is a layering of AI and human in a very finely layered manner to provide such an incredible CX that they start to grow revenues. If you look at businesses, reducing costs is cool, and that's something that I bet if we did another survey, 99% of the people on this call have been asked to do. But when you grow revenues, suddenly the budget restrictions start to go away. So this cycle isn't a go through it and then come back and go through it again. It's a go through it to phase 3 and actually solve the budget problem by shifting to revenue growth. The side effect of that revenue growth is you only get it when your CX is fantastic. And my personal belief is the world could use better CX than generally I experience as a consumer. Hence, the bold statement, considering what we've talked about for the last 30 minutes, the bold statement that we're at the very start of the golden age of CX. We have the tools available. We just shared with you a plan to get this done and get around all of the barriers that you could potentially encounter. We're not saying it's going to be a simple ride, but there is a path through. Super excited about the future. On that note, thank you, Mr. Luther. I appreciate your wisdom as always. I would like to introduce my other co-host. Because of non-disclosure agreements, which we take really seriously, we can't bring you a customer. However, our good friend Mark has been through this journey, and I wanted to bring him on and have him share his experience because it illustrates not just what this actually works, but also what it's like doing it without us in the process. So, Mark, welcome. Thank you for being on. Could you take a minute, since we didn't introduce you at the start, to sharing a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Tom. Enjoyed being here with you guys today. And Andrew, you and I have been talking for a while about this, so I feel really passionately about this topic. A little bit about my background. I think Tom said it earlier, 20 years. I'm in your boat, Andrew. I'm a little bit over that now in the CX, primarily contact center space. 20 years ago, I was launching BPOs for PayPal in the Philippines, and it was all the rage in those days. So kind of that's where I got my start. I spent a few years, about 3 years with Amazon here in the US, about 5 years with Google. And then most recently, I led and built out the customer experience function for the recurring revenue business at Roku over the last 3.5 years. Actually left there at the end of last year and have spent the first 6 months of this year really getting frankly, spending a lot of time learning about these different technologies, because as we got really deep into the weeds of, okay, what is all of this automation technology? Everybody's saying it solves all the problems, like without having a data set, which is one of the questions, right? But that was one of the, so what I figured out was like these last 3 or 4 months, just learning about what's actually in the marketplace and what it can do would be really valuable. So been doing that and actually, just starting a new role next this coming Monday with a software company called Sovos. So
one of the few people I've met whose past history of who you've worked for, you don't have to explain what any of the companies do.
yeah, that's really fortunate, right? And I've worked for a few small ones. I didn't call those ones out because I didn't want to take 3 minutes to talk about who they are. But yeah, no, I've been really fortunate. And have worked for some of the bigger technology companies in the world that are building a lot of this technology that we're talking about today. So yeah, that's been a real blessing.
So, as our stand-in for a customer, Mark, can you talk about, you've been on that side? It's where you spent most of your career. Is not the guy showing up saying we've got to solve to this, but actually the one, like most of our audience, dealing with the problem internally.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share an example of the situation you found yourself in?
Yeah, sure. Before I do that, real quick, I will say one thing about the poll that was really, or the survey,
Yeah.
really interesting to me was how I think it was 1 out of 30 or 35 that was concerned about the data. I will tell you that was very interesting to me. I thought that would be higher, more so than the budget side. But it wasn't at all surprising to see how many people were concerned about what this stuff actually might do. As you mentioned, I think fairly well, or articulating it might impact some of our employment status if it all goes wrong. But to give you a little bit of a background, I'll just kind of speak to my most recent experience. I joined Roku at the end of 2020. Or actually, just started the first week of 2021 when it was really clear that the pandemic was going to have a massive impact on not only the business as far as it growing exponentially because of folks being stuck inside and watching a lot of TV, but really on the overall strategic thought process for the company as it related to CX. Historically, up until 2019, 2020, the company had really deployed how do we put up the best FAQs possible and then just hope customers figure it out. And then, to be quite frank, make it sort of challenging for them to get a hold of a human, because there wasn't a lot of faith internally, because some of the stuff that Tom, I'm sure, is very familiar with, he mentioned it, hire, train, invest, do it all again the next year, right? Like this whole notion of a constant, like it's a vicious cycle. Then there's BPOs get a bad rap for it, and I think if you don't have a good relationship with one, it can kind of go wrong. But that's what had been going on there for a number of years. And so when I joined, one of the things I did, of course, right out of the gate was assess the BPOs that we worked with. And one of the key things that I learned right out of the gate was we weren't effectively training people. We weren't empowering them essentially with the tool sets that were required to make them successful as human agents, right? Not even getting into the automation side of it. So what I did was I immediately went right in and looked at who were the partners, what were they delivering, what were the cost models, what were the labor models, like, and all of that good stuff. And we were able to, through a competitive RFP and going through a couple of different processes, to really put some basically some stress onto the partners we had to really step up their performance. We were able to optimize, and like the journey you and Tom just talked about, we were able to create some pretty significant savings through doing things that are pretty simple, but moving from an FTE model to a productive hour model, which took a bit of investment with our technology, but we did that. That was a really big step that created some savings for us. And also in that competitive RFP, looking at different providers, looking at different geos, we looked, at that time we were all offshore. Ultimately, I was able to create enough savings to bring some back on shore to do, so we created an innovation lab actually in Austin, Texas, that allowed us to test workflows before we sort of released them to the wild, if you will. So it was a really cool journey that I got to go on with and built out a team to do.
So that was before we met.
Right.
This was completely independent. It's always nice when you're building out a strategy and you find people that have done the same thing in roughly the same timeline in almost like a separate universe, right? So what I heard you say is labor optimization and sandbox for technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So those were critical pieces. Can you talk about, because you did it, you took it on yourself to find that budget, go through the RFP process, do all that work yourself. How much of a lift was that without having outsourced consultants as a helper or a guide through that process? Was that painful or was that easy?
Yeah, it was pretty significant, right? We had to, it was definitely not easy. We had to take a lot. I mean, we are thinking back to, I think it was the fall of 21. I mean, we basically, our OKRs for a couple of quarters were, the whole team were focused on making sure we brought in the right partners. We looked at the right, we were out looking at what is the latest and greatest as far as, what types of questions do we need to look at as it relates to the viability of the business, security, location. So we did all of that kind of collaboratively internally as a team. We were a very small team at the time as well. We were doing that while also trying to continue the narrative around why does CX need to be a priority for the business, right? So we're doing that. And then also building the foundational infrastructure of a good customer experience operation, right? So we kind of had three focus areas, and it took up an enormous amount of time, and ultimately was successful, but it could have been done, I think, a lot faster in a model where we actually had some support from experts that do this every day.
I bet there's some empathy from the audience there when you consider Mark's situation. So working for an in-home entertainment organization during COVID and telling your leadership that CX was going to be important when they had people beating down their door regardless of what the experience was. But that foresight of knowing that things would shift sooner or later, right? Business always does. And really what you're left with at some point is the demand normalizes, and then people start to be really concerned about, okay, now I have more supply than there is demand. What's the best solution for me? And you've got two things left at the end of the day. It's either you're the cheapest or you suck less than the others.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Those are the two ways to differentiate yourself in business. And you can make your choice from a business strategy, which you want, but probably from a revenue growth perspective, having a CX advantage is the way to go.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
I would say as it relates to this, the topic of AI, is I've spent a lot of time, as I said, over these last couple of months focused on this, and as a practitioner, as someone that's interested in deploying these technologies myself, we weren't in a place 3 years ago to be deploying a generative AI, chatbot, for instance. There was a lot of other chatbots that had elements of AI, but they weren't in the same vein as they are today. What we actually did was make investments in things like a really slick knowledge base that allowed our advisors and invested the time to build out the knowledge, the framework of what's in that knowledge base. We invested in a quality tool as well as a learning management system. And all those things, I think, in today's world are being reevaluated for their value versus how much value can an AI tool, right? Because it's not necessarily an and story. It could be an and or story with some of these newer tools. But I would just say that those savings that we were able to create out of the labor assessment that we did, we went out and paid for all of those tools. Those weren't things that we had to go back to the business and say, hey, we need new funding for this. It actually fell within budget for the following year, right? So it just kind of plays into that narrative, I think, that you talked about, that this is a doable thing. It's not necessarily super simple, but it can be probably simpler if you bring folks in to give you a hand with it that have done it before. I think ultimately, the last thing I would say about that is that, like, in today's world, I think there's good reason to be suspicious and a little worried about what generative AI can do. But I'm also a huge fan and an advocate of deploying it internally first, right? We rolled out a pilot shortly before I left Roku. I think they've changed direction since, and they're going to go direct to consumer, from what I understand. But like, I'm a big fan of getting some of this technology, similar to what you said, Andrew, and just sort of like make your team, whether they be in-house or outsourced, make them the folks that get to kind of test this technology out, take it for a ride, see where it fails, right? And get comfortable with it such that you can deploy it to your customers. So I think that's a really big part of any strategy. It's kind of in tech, you talk about eating your own dog food, right? Like at Google, Gmail was a beta for 7 years, right? Like it really was. Like it was released to the public, but it was still quote unquote in beta internally. So it's just, I think that's an important call out as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Much appreciate those insights. It's always good to hear from somebody that's been through the journey and done it themselves. So I appreciate that. That wraps up the presentations. We've got time allowed for Q&A. I do see that we have, actually related to what we were just talking about, Mark, there's a question, the first one I see in the Q&A, and please, anybody else, anything that we've kind of scratched your curiosity on, go ahead, throw questions in there. The first one is, how do we avoid disasters in live AI chatbots and reduce the risk of unpredictable responses, also known as AI hallucinations? And then there's an additional note, the questions related to managing risk on outcomes from IT for business case presentations. I'll take the first swing, and I'm sure Mark and Tom will have some input. I'm not going to address this from the technology side. I'm going to address this from the strategy side. Where we've seen the best risk mitigation, and I'm giving a broader answer because that's a specific question. I'm sure we'll get into the specifics with Mark and Tom. The broader answer here is there is risk with AI. Please put that in context with humans are risky too. Do not think for a moment that even the best managed contact centers purely staffed with humans have 100% accuracy rate. They don't. Where the best future that I can predict comes from is layering in the two. And, the errors in the pictures that I showed earlier, and there was another one, the lady with the headset actually had two headsets. One came out of the side of her face, right? AI can't tell. We can all tell. And when you layer in the things that we're good at as people and the things that AI is good at, that's really when you end up overall with a much lower risk scenario. The flip side is if you do it wrong and you do them in isolation and you apply them to the wrong things, you can get all the worst of AI and all the worst of the human side and actually end up with a more risky situation. So that's my not quite answer. Who wants to take it next? Mark, you want to go next?
Quick, yeah, I can jump in real quick. I think as it relates to avoiding disasters, right? Because I mean, this is it's a nascent technology. To Andrew's point, I don't think there's any way to put. I wouldn't go say I'm going to put my future at this company on the line. There's no way that something couldn't go wrong. Like I think there's always got to be an element of that. And Andrew said that very well. It's just as possible that an agent could do something pretty ridiculous or boneheaded as well, not necessarily because they're doing something wrong, like trying to, or malicious, just because it happens and they're confused, right? And I think, but also following on what Andrew said, I think the way to avoid that is get incredibly specific about what you want AI to accomplish, right? Think about transactional type questions, think about refund type questions. And e-commerce is a very highly sought after area for this type of technology today, because it's very binary type situations, right? So I think one, IT needs to understand in today's world, there's no way to eliminate hallucinations altogether. The way I thought about it when I was building out the proof of concept at Roku was, let's limit the ability of the AI, the LLMs that drive AI, limit their scope to the knowledge base and perhaps some internal process documentations that we had that were not public knowledge. And that's how we were thinking about it. We weren't going to, I think the thing you got to be careful about is people are going to always assume AI is out scrolling the entire internet. You can make it much smaller what it has access to. And I think that's the way to prevent these hallucinations that we'd like you were saying, Andrew, like you get a free, ticket on Alaska Airlines or whatever it was, whatever that big one was, where it was like a couple $1,000s. But ultimately, AI needs to be explained as a nascent technology that has a lot of opportunity, but there's a possibility for error, and I think you just have to build that into your risk case.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, I'm always thinking about these things from an operator's perspective. In my former life, I was a big Six Sigma guy, right? And I think I always think about DMAIC, right? And I'm sure, Kamalesh, to your question, I think that, it's about making sure that you have a robust DMAIC process in place. You're defining exactly what you're intending to do. How are you going to measure it? Are you analyzing what you're doing? Focus on implementation at a slow pace, and then ultimately controlling the good and the bad. And I think, as you're pointing your business case out to your CFO, like we talked about earlier, and other stakeholders, that's the plan they're going to want to make sure of. Is how do we mitigate as much risk as we can as we deploy this, in line with a lot of what Mark just said. So happy to take that offline, but I think having that plan clearly defined about preparing for the worst, I think will gain, the confidence of the team as you go forward.
Awesome. I appreciate both of you guys sharing your much more specific answers than the generic one that I give, which is, blend things together. So Tom and I have spent a significant amount of time at events, and one of the encouraging things that we've seen is a universal maybe not quite, but getting there. Acknowledgement that you have to have both. That really the technology on its own is not a solve. The people on their own is not the right solve. It's when you put the two together that really that comment that I made earlier about we're at the start of the golden age starts to sound a little less ridiculous and a little more plausible, because combining the two is where something special lies. I don't see any more questions. We figured this might happen. We're getting into strategy and specifics, and there's a lot of confidentiality around that. So completely understand not wanting them to be aired publicly. So you can reach out. My email address is on the screen. If you want to have a chat, a conversation, if you want to bounce strategy ideas off of us, happy to do that. Also, one of the unique things, Mark was good enough to join us. He's also kindly offered to talk with any of you guys that want a conversation, not with the strategists of Outsource Consultants, but just with Mark as another human being that's been down this path himself and want to have more of a conversation on that level. Let me know. I can connect you with Mark. There's no need for us to be involved in that conversation unless you want us to be. So really, next steps are open to you in terms of, hopefully this was insightful. Hopefully there were things here that perhaps hadn't quite clicked into the level of clarity that we've gained from doing it as many times as we have. And if there's ways that we can serve you and help you on your journey, we'd be delighted to do that. Please reach out to us. Jared, anything else before we wrap up? Any questions lurking that I missed?
No, the voice from behind the curtain. We really appreciate everyone in attendance joining us. And thanks so much to Andrew, Tom, Mark. Luckily, we will have this recording to you within the next 24 hours. And we appreciate everyone's attendance.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
guys.